Hey guys, tonight we descend into the lavish, absurd, and occasionally unsanitary world of ancient Rome, where power, lust, and absolutely no concept of boundaries collided in spectacular fashion for over 1,200 years. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me tell you, what we're diving into today makes modern political drama look like a polite disagreement over dinner reservations. Picture this. You're living in an age where your emperor was probably chosen by whoever had the most soldiers. Contraception was basically sacrificing to the right gods, and the concept of privacy meant closing your villa door, maybe. In this world, political opposition wasn't just disagreement. It was a death sentence, a family curse, and often a one-way ticket to some truly creative forms of execution that would make modern politicians weep with gratitude for their simple Twitter controversies. That's right, we're talking about ancient Rome, a civilization that started as a tiny city-state founded by wolf-raised twins. Yes, really, and somehow managed to conquer most of the known world. Invent concrete that's still stronger than modern stuff. Create a legal system we still use today. And then spectacularly implode in the most Roman way possible, with style, violence, and a healthy dose of hold my wine and watch this. So buckle up, because we're about to take a journey through murders, marriages, military genius, monumental stupidity, and enough political intrigue to make House of Cards look like a children's bedtime story. This is the entire history of ancient Rome, from a collection of hills by a river to the greatest empire the world had ever seen, to the spectacular mess that ended with Germanic tribes basically saying, "Thanks for playing, we'll take it from here." Let's be honest, every great nation needs a good origin story. Americans have the founding fathers, the French have their revolution, and the Romans? Well, the Romans had twin babies raised by a she-wolf, a city founded by fratricide, and a population problem solved by literally stealing women from neighboring tribes. If you thought modern politics were messy, think again. The story begins around 753 BCE with Romulus and Remus, twin brothers supposedly descended from the Trojan. Hero Aeneas and fathered by Mars, the god of war. Their grandfather was a king. Their great-uncle was a usurper, and their mother was a Vestal virgin who definitely broke her vow of chastity. Sound familiar? It's like a soap opera written by people who really liked violence. According to legend, the evil great-uncle Amulius ordered the babies drowned in the Tiber River. But here's where it gets wonderfully ridiculous. The basket containing the twins washed ashore, and a she-wolf found them and decided to adopt them. That's right. Rome was literally founded by feral children. Modern child services would have had a field day. Meanwhile, a shepherd named Faustulus discovered the boys being nursed by their lupine foster mother and thought, well, this seems normal, and took them home. To be fair, if you're living in central Italy in the 8th century BCE, wolf-raised children probably weren't the weirdest thing you'd encounter on a Tuesday. The twins grew up strong, charismatic, and with absolutely no conflict resolution skills. Which, let's be clear, would become a defining characteristic of Roman culture for the next 1,000 years. When they decided to found a city, they couldn't agree on where to put it. Romulus wanted the Palatine Hill. Remus wanted the Aventine Hill. Both received the omens from the gods. Both claimed divine approval, and both were apparently too stubborn to just flip a coin. The argument escalated, because of course it did, until Romulus killed his own brother over a property dispute. And thus Rome was born, literally built on fratricide, which is either incredibly dark or incredibly on-brand, depending on how you look at the next 1,200 years of Roman history. Romulus became the first king of Rome and immediately faced a demographic crisis that would make modern dating apps weep. His new city was full of men, outlaws, refugees, runaway slaves, and various troublemakers who'd fled to this new settlement. Still, they had no women, which posed obvious problems for long-term urban planning. The solution? The rape of the Sabine women, which sounds worse than it was, but was still pretty terrible. Romulus invited the neighboring Sabines to a festival, and when everyone was having a good time, the Roman men grabbed the Sabine women and carried them off to be wives. It was basically the world's most problematic bachelor party. If you thought the story would end there, think again. The Sabine men naturally wanted their women back and prepared for war. But here's where it gets interesting. The Sabine women, who by now had been living in Rome for a while, some with children, threw themselves between the two armies and essentially said, "Look, we're already here. We've got kids. Our husbands aren't actually that bad once you get used to them. So can everyone just calm down and work this out?" The result was one of history's first recorded peace negotiations mediated by women, leading to the Sabines and Romans merging into one people. The women basically solved a military crisis through practical relationship counseling, which is probably the most sensible thing that happened in early Roman history. Romulus ruled for 37 years and then, according to legend, disappeared during a thunderstorm and became a god. That's right. Rome's first leader pulled the ultimate Irish exit, leaving behind a city that would spend the next millennium trying to live up to his example of solving problems through violence and then somehow making it work out. After Romulus came 6 more kings, each contributing their own special brand of chaos to Roman development. Numa Pompilius was the religious one who created most of Rome's sacred institutions and somehow managed to rule for 43 years without fighting a single war. Clearly, he didn't understand the assignment. Tullus Hostilius was so warlike that he made Romulus look peaceful. Ancus Marcius built Rome's first bridge and expanded the city to the sea. And yet, it was Tarquin the Proud, the 7th and final king, who really understood Roman politics. He was everything you'd expect from the name Tarquin the Proud: arrogant, tyrannical, and completely convinced that rules were for other people. He seized power through murder, ruled through fear, and generally behaved like someone who'd learned statcraft from a Machiavelli handbook written by someone with anger management issues. Of course, Tarquin's downfall came through a family scandal involving his son Sextus and a Roman noblewoman named Lucretia. Sextus assaulted Lucretia. She told her family, demanded justice, and then killed herself from shame. The Roman nobles, led by Lucius Junius Brutus, yes, that Brutus family, decided they'd had enough of kings altogether. By 509 BCE, the Romans had overthrown their monarchy and declared themselves a republic. No more kings, they said. Power would be shared, they insisted. The people would have a voice, they promised. It was a beautiful moment of democratic idealism that would last exactly until the first time someone really wanted to be in charge. Still, give the Romans credit. They'd gone from wolf boys to functional city-state in about 250 years, which isn't bad considering they'd started with fratricide and kidnapping. They'd established religious institutions, built infrastructure, expanded their territory, and developed a political system based on shared power and civic responsibility. If you thought this newfound commitment to Republican values would prevent future power struggles, massive egos, and spectacular political violence, well, let's just say you're about to be very entertained by the next 500 years of Roman history. Meanwhile, in 509 BCE, the Romans were about to embark on one of history's most successful experiments in republican government. And like most successful experiments, it would eventually explode in spectacular fashion. But let's be clear, they had a good run first. The new Roman Republic was built on a simple principle. Never again would one man hold absolute power. Sound familiar? The founding fathers of America certainly thought so when they were designing their own system 2,000 years later. The Romans created a system of checks and balances that would have made Montesquieu weep with joy. At the top were two consuls. Think of them as co-presidents who served for 1 year and could veto each other's decisions. It was like having two CEOs running the same company, which sounds like a recipe for disaster, but somehow worked because both consuls knew that if they messed up too badly, they'd face prosecution the moment they left office. That's right. Roman politicians actually faced consequences for their actions. Revolutionary concept. Below the consuls was the Senate, which started as an advisory body of former magistrates and evolved into the most exclusive boys' club in world history. These weren't elected representatives. They were former office holders who'd earned their spot through service and, let's be honest, by being born into the right families. The Senate didn't make laws, but they controlled foreign policy, managed finances, and generally acted like they owned the place, which, economically speaking, they basically did. Then there were the various magistrates, praetors who handled legal affairs, quaestors who managed finances, and aediles who were basically ancient city managers responsible for roads, markets, and making sure the gladiator games ran on time. To be fair, having politicians whose job was literally make sure the entertainment doesn't suck was probably more honest than most modern campaign promises. And yet, for all this elaborate power sharing, the early republic had one tiny problem. It was run entirely by patricians, the old aristocratic families who traced their lineage back to Romulus's original supporters. The plebeians, everyone else from small farmers to urban craftsmen, could vote in assemblies but couldn't hold major offices. It was democracy with a velvet rope, and the bouncers were really serious about the guest list. If you thought the plebeians would quietly accept this arrangement forever, think again. By 494 BCE, they'd had enough and did something so. Ramen at Hertz. They went on strike. Not a normal strike. They literally left the city and set up their own settlement on the Aventine Hill, leaving the patricians to run Rome by themselves. Suddenly, the patricians discovered that a city-state actually needs people to function. Who was going to serve in the army? Who was going to work the shops? Who was going to pay taxes? Faced with economic collapse and military vulnerability, the patricians did what any reasonable ruling class would do. They negotiated. The result was the creation of tribunes of the plebs, officials elected specifically to represent plebeian interests and protect them from patrician abuse. These tribunes had an incredible power. They could veto any decision by any magistrate, including consuls. It was like giving the Union representative nuclear weapons, and it worked beautifully as long as everyone agreed to play by the rules. Still, the plebeians wanted more, and over the next 200 years, they got it through a series of struggles that historians call the conflict of the orders, which sounds much more dignified than class warfare, ancient edition. By 367 BCE, plebeians could become consul. By 300 BCE, they can hold any office. By 287 BCE, decisions by the plebeian assembly had the force of law over all citizens. Let's be clear about what happened here. Rome had evolved from an aristocratic republic into something approaching actual democracy, and they did it without a revolution, civil war, or mass executions. They just negotiated, argued loudly, threatened each other, occasionally stormed out in dramatic fashion, but ultimately worked things out through political compromise. It was perhaps the most un-Roman thing Romans ever did, and it worked. Meanwhile, Rome was also busy conquering Italy, because apparently managing internal political reform wasn't exciting enough. The Romans had a simple foreign policy. If you're not with us, you're eventually going to be with us anyway. So let's skip the unpleasantness and work something out. Their method was brilliantly practical. When they conquered a city, they didn't massacre everyone or demand tribute. Instead, they offered a deal. Keep your local government, keep your customs, keep your gods, but provide soldiers when we call and don't make foreign policy without asking. Some cities got full Roman citizenship, others got partial citizenship, and everyone got protection from other potential conquerors. It was like a protection racket run by people who actually provided excellent protection and decent customer service. Sound familiar? The Romans basically invented the franchise system 2,000 years before McDonald's. By 264 BCE, Rome controlled all of Italy south of the Po Valley, not through brutal oppression, but through a combination of military success and political genius that made resistance seem pointless and cooperation profitable. They'd created a confederation of Italian peoples who saw themselves as partners in a growing enterprise rather than subjects of a foreign power. The Roman military machine that made this possible was unlike anything the world had seen. The famous Roman legions weren't just well-trained, they were adaptable, disciplined, and led by officers who understood that winning battles was less important than winning wars. Roman soldiers served for decades, not just for single campaigns, creating a professional military class that could learn from defeats and implement innovations. To be fair, the Romans also had tremendous advantages. Italy's geography protected them from serious foreign invasion while allowing them to project power outward. The Italian peninsula had enough agricultural wealth to support large armies, enough mineral resources for weapons and tools, and enough manpower to absorb casualties that would have crippled smaller states. And yet, by the middle of the 3rd century BCE, Rome faced a choice that would define the next phase of its history. Italy was conquered, internal politics were relatively stable, and the Roman system was working beautifully. They could have stopped there, focused on internal development, maybe worked on improving their trade relationships and cultural achievements. Of course, they didn't stop. Because just across the Mediterranean was Carthage, another growing power with its own imperial ambitions, its own military genius, and its own ideas about who should control the lucrative trade routes of the ancient world. The stage was set for a conflict that would determine not just who controlled the Mediterranean, but whether Roman republicanism would survive the pressures of imperial expansion. Spoiler alert, the Republic would win the war, but lose something essential in the process. Still, in 264 BCE, Romans could look back on 245 years of republican government with justified pride. They'd created a system that balanced competing interests, protected individual rights, expanded opportunity, and built the strongest state in the Western Mediterranean. They'd proven that people could govern themselves without kings or tyrants. If you thought this success would make them humble, cautious, or satisfied with what they'd achieved, well, you clearly haven't been paying attention to Roman character development so far. By 264 BCE, Rome had become the dominant power in Italy and was looking around the Mediterranean like a successful startup eyeing expansion opportunities. And yet, they were about to discover that running a local business and managing a global empire are two very different skill sets. A lesson that would be written in blood, treasure, and the occasional elephant crossing the Alps. The trouble started with Sicily. That's right. Rome's transformation from Italian regional power to Mediterranean superpower began with an argument over an island that most Romans probably couldn't find on a map. But Sicily controlled the trade routes between east and west, and both Rome and Carthage wanted it. Sound familiar? It's like two tech companies fighting over market share, except with more war elephants and significantly less venture capital. Carthage, for those keeping track, was the other great power of the Western Mediterranean. Founded by Phoenicians from modern-day Lebanon, it had grown into a commercial empire that made Rome look like a small-town chamber of commerce. Carthaginians were master traders, skilled diplomats, and, here's the important part, they had a navy that could blockade Roman ports faster then you could say maritime supremacy. Let's be clear about Rome's naval situation in 264 BCE. They didn't have one. Rome was a land power trying to fight a sea war against people who'd been perfecting naval warfare for centuries. It would be like a chess grandmaster challenging Serena Williams to tennis. Theoretically possible to win, but you better have a really good strategy. The Romans, being Romans, decided their strategy would be to build a navy from scratch and figure out how to use it through trial and error. They allegedly captured a Carthaginian ship, reverse-engineered it, and built 100 copies in 60 days. Whether this story is true or not, it perfectly captures the Roman approach to problems. If we don't know how to do something, we'll learn by doing it badly until we get better. The First Punic War, 264-241 BCE, lasted 23 years and featured some of the largest naval battles in ancient history. Rome lost entire fleets to storms, inexperience, and Carthaginian expertise. But they kept building ships and training sailors like their civilization depended on it. Which, to be fair, it probably did. The turning point came when Romans realized they couldn't outsail Carthaginians, so they turned naval combat into land combat. They invented the corvus, basically a boarding plank with a spike that they drop onto enemy ships, allowing Roman soldiers to fight on Carthaginian decks. It was like bringing a knife to a gunfight, except the knife was actually a bridge, and somehow it worked. Meanwhile, the war was bankrupting both sides. Carthage had superior resources, but couldn't decisive victory. Rome had superior manpower, but couldn't afford to keep losing fleets. Both sides were learning the first rule of great power competition. It's not about who's stronger. It's about who can stay strong longer. Rome finally won by doing what they did best, outlasting their opponents, through sheer bloody-minded determination. By 241 BCE, Carthage agreed to pay massive war reparations and give up Sicily. Rome had won its first overseas province and learned a valuable lesson. Imperialism was expensive but profitable, exhausting but addictive. If you thought this victory would satisfy Roman ambitions, think again. Success is like potato chips for empires. You can't have just one. Within a few years, Rome had taken Sardinia and Corsica from a weakened Carthage, essentially kicking an opponent while they were down. It wasn't Rome's most honorable moment, but it established a pattern. When Romans saw weakness, they exploited it. This brings us to Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian general who decided that if Rome wanted to play imperial power games, he'd teach them why that was a terrible idea. Hannibal is often called one of history's greatest military geniuses, and his strategy for fighting Rome was so audacious, it still makes military historians giggle with excitement. Instead of fighting Rome's navy, he'd march an army from Spain, through Gaul, over the Alps, and attack Italy itself. That's right. Hannibal's plan was to walk from Barcelona to Rome with 90,000 men, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. It was the ancient equivalent of proposing to invade Russia in winter, except Hannibal actually pulled it off. The journey over the Alps in 218 BCE was an epic of human endurance and strategic brilliance. Hannibal lost half his army to cold, exhaustion, and hostile mountain tribes, but he made it to Italy with enough forces to terrify every Roman citizen who heard the news. Sound familiar? It's like learning that your business competitor just moved their headquarters to your hometown and is hiring all your best employees. For the next 16 years, Hannibal rampaged through Italy, winning battle after battle and making Roman military doctrine look like it had been designed by particularly slow children. At Cannae, in 216 BCE, he destroyed the largest army Rome had ever fielded. 80,000 men killed or captured in a single day, through tactical genius that military academies still study today. And yet, here's where Roman character showed itself. They didn't surrender. Most civilizations would have negotiated peace after losing their entire military and having an enemy army camping in their backyard. Rome just raised more armies. The Senate passed a resolution forbidding anyone from even discussing peace terms. They were like a boxer who keeps getting knocked down but refuses to stay down. Except the boxer had the resources of the entire Italian peninsula. To be fair, Rome had several advantages that Hannibal couldn't overcome. First, most Italian allies stayed loyal. The Roman system of partnership rather than domination finally paid dividends. Second, Rome's citizen soldiers had been trained to see military service as civic duty, not just temporary employment. Third, Roman logistics and engineering allowed them to support multiple armies simultaneously, while Hannibal struggled to maintain one. Still, the real Roman genius was strategic patience. Instead of trying to defeat Hannibal directly, they adopted what became known as Fabian tactics, avoiding pitched battles, attacking his supply lines, and gradually wearing down his forces through attrition. It was like dealing with a brilliant but unstable coworker by just outlasting their energy for conflict. Meanwhile, Rome opened a second front by invading Spain and attacking Carthage itself in Africa. By 202 BCE, Hannibal was recalled to defend his homeland, where he finally lost at the Battle of Zama to Scipio Africanus, a Roman general who'd studied Hannibal's tactics and learned how to beat him at his own game. The Second Punic War ended with Carthage completely defeated, forced to pay enormous reparations, and reduced to a Roman client state. Rome had survived its greatest existential threat and emerged as the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. They'd also learned that imperialism required different skills than republicanism, and the two might not be entirely compatible. Of course, Romans being Romans, they decided the solution was more imperialism. Over the next 60 years, they conquered Macedonia, Greece, Asia Minor, and most of Spain. Each victory brought wealth, slaves, and territorial responsibilities that strained the republican system designed for governing a city-state. By 146 BCE, Rome had destroyed both Carthage and Corinth in the same year, eliminating their last serious rivals and announcing to the world that Roman patience had limits. The destruction of Carthage was particularly brutal. Romans literally plowed salt into the soil and cursed the site to remain empty forever. It was ancient cancel culture, except with actual violence. Let's be honest about what Rome had become by the middle of the 2nd century BCE. They were running a Mediterranean-wide empire through institutions designed for governing central Italy. The wealth pouring in from conquered territories was creating unprecedented prosperity and unprecedented inequality. Small farmers couldn't compete with slave-worked estates. Urban mobs demanded bread and entertainment, and successful generals were returning from campaigns with armies that were more loyal to their commanders than to the state. Still, the most dangerous development was cultural. Romans had always prided themselves on their virtue, discipline, and civic responsibility. But exposure to Greek philosophy, Eastern luxury, and imperial wealth was creating new values that emphasized individual achievement over collective good. The Roman elite was becoming cosmopolitan, sophisticated, and increasingly disconnected from the citizen soldiers who'd made their conquests possible. And yet, the system was still working. Sort of. The Senate maintained control over foreign policy. Elections were still held regularly, and Roman law still protected citizen rights. It was like a successful small business that had grown into a multinational corporation, but was still using the original partnership agreement. The crisis came from an unexpected source. The Gracchi brothers, 2 Roman politicians, who noticed that imperial success was destroying the citizen farmers who formed the backbone of Roman society. Their proposed solutions, land redistribution, debt relief, and political reforms, were reasonable responses to real problems. The Roman establishment's reaction was to murder both brothers and their supporters in broad daylight in the center of Rome. By 133 BCE, Roman politics had crossed a line that no republic can cross and remain a republic. They'd made violence an acceptable response to political disagreement. If you thought Roman leaders would recognize this as a dangerous precedent and work to restore normal political discourse, well, let's just say the next chapter involves several civil wars, a few dictatorships, and enough political murders to make Shakespearean tragedies look optimistic. Meanwhile, by 133 BCE, the Roman Republic was like a high-performance sports car with a cracked engine block, still moving forward impressively, but making ominous sounds that suggested catastrophic failure was imminent. The murder of Tiberius Gracchus had crossed a line that no healthy democracy should cross. But Roman politicians, being Roman politicians, decided the solution was to cross it again, harder and with more style. Let's be clear about what the Gracchi brothers were trying to do. They'd noticed that Rome's military success was destroying the citizen farmers who made that success possible. Conquest brought wealth, but that wealth was concentrated in the hands of elites who used slave labor to work massive estates, driving small farmers off their land and into urban poverty. Sound familiar? It's basically every economic inequality debate in human history, except with more togas and significantly less Twitter. Tiberius Gracchus proposed land redistribution, taking unused public land from wealthy elites and giving it to landless citizens. This wasn't radical socialism. It was restoring an older Roman ideal where citizens owned enough property to serve in the military and participate in civic life. To be fair, it would have worked if the Roman elite had been interested in preserving republican institutions rather than protecting their portfolios. Instead, they killed them, not through legal prosecution or political maneuvering, but through actual mob violence in the center of Rome. The consul led a gang of senators and their clients who beat Tiberius and 300 of his supporters to death with clubs and chair legs. It was like a shareholder meeting turned into a scene from The Purge. And yet, this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. 10 years later, Tiberius's brother Gaius became tribune and picked up where his brother had left off, except with more comprehensive reforms and better political organization. Gaius Gracchus was everything Roman politicians were supposed to be: intelligent, charismatic, genuinely concerned with the welfare of citizens, and absolutely doomed. Gaius pushed through grain subsidies for urban citizens, judicial reforms that weakened senatorial power, and land distribution programs that actually worked. For a brief moment, it looked like the Republic might reform itself and address the contradictions between imperial wealth and Republican citizenship. If you thought the Roman establishment would learn from their previous experience and find constructive ways to address these concerns, think again. They murdered Gaius too, along with 3,000 of his supporters. This time, they didn't even pretend. It was a riot. The consul armed gladiators and foreign mercenaries to hunt down Roman citizens in the streets of Rome. The Republic had officially entered its political problems are best solved through mass murder phase. Still, the most dangerous precedent wasn't the violence. It was the precedent that ambitious politicians could build careers by appealing directly to popular assemblies against the Senate's wishes. The Gracchi had discovered that Roman citizens, when properly organized, could override traditional elite control. This was either the salvation of Republican government or its death sentence, depending on who learned the lesson. Entered Gaius Marius, a military genius with the political subtlety of a brick through a window. Marius looked at the Roman military system and noticed it had a fatal flaw. It relied on citizen farmers, who often couldn't afford their own equipment and had farms that couldn't survive their absence during long campaigns. His solution was elegantly simple and catastrophically dangerous. Professional soldiers. The Marian military reforms created legions of career soldiers who served for decades, were equipped by the state, and expected land grants when they retired. It was a brilliant military innovation that made Roman armies more effective than ever before. Of course, it also meant that soldiers were more loyal to the generals, who led them to victory and provided their retirement benefits than to the abstract concept of republican government. Meanwhile, Marius was using his military success and popular appeal to get elected consul an unprecedented 6 times, completely ignoring the traditional rule that consuls served only 1 year and waited a decade between terms. It was like a president deciding term limits were more of a guideline than an actual rule. The Roman establishment, having learned exactly nothing from the Greek experience, decided their best response was to find their own populist strongman. Enter Lucius Cornelius Sulla, an aristocratic general who believed the solution to political violence was more political violence, applied more systematically. Sulla and Marius represented 2 competing visions of Rome's future. Marius championed popular assemblies, land distribution, and expansion of citizenship. Sulla defended traditional senatorial authority, aristocratic privilege, and constitutional government. Both were perfectly willing to use armies against civilian government to achieve their goals. The result was Rome's first civil war, and like most Roman civil wars, it was simultaneously tragic and absurd. Marius and Sulla took turns capturing Rome, murdering their opponents and implementing reforms that the next guy would immediately overturn. It was like a deadly game of political musical chairs, where the music kept stopping and starting. Let's be honest about what this meant. By 88 BCE, Roman generals were marching legions against Rome itself. The city that had conquered the Mediterranean couldn't maintain basic political order in its own form. Citizens were fleeing to the countryside to avoid proscription lists, official death warrants that made enemies of the state. Fair game for bounty hunters. Sulla eventually won by being more ruthlessly systematic than his opponents. His proscription lists killed thousands of Roman citizens, including 90 senators and 2,600 equestrians, wealthy business class. He confiscated their property, distributed it to his supporters, and established a reign of terror that made the Greek murders look like a minor disagreement. And yet, having seized absolute power, Sulla did something unprecedented in Roman history. He voluntarily gave it up. In 79 BCE, he restored the consulship, reinforced the Senate's authority, and retired to private life. He'd killed thousands of Romans to save the Republic, then walked away from supreme power because he genuinely believed in republican institutions. Of course, Sulla's constitutional reforms lasted approximately 15 minutes in historical terms. He'd solved the immediate crisis through violence, but hadn't addressed any of the underlying problems that caused it. Roman politicians had learned that armies could override elections, that popular appeal could trump traditional authority, and that murder was an acceptable political tactic. Meanwhile, new ambitious men were rising who'd observed Sulla's career and drawn their own conclusions. Gnaeus Pompey Magnus, Pompey the Great, had built his reputation by cleaning up Sulla's messes and was discovering he quite liked being Rome's go-to problem solver. Marcus Licinius Crassus had gotten fantastically wealthy buying proscribed property at fire sale prices and was looking for political influence to match his economic power. And somewhere in the background, a young aristocrat named Gaius Julius Caesar was watching all of this and taking notes. Caesar had been on Marius's side during the Civil War, had survived Sulla's proscriptions, and was learning that successful Roman politicians needed 3 things: military victory, popular support, and enough money to buy both. By 70 BCE, Pompey and Crassus were elected consuls, despite technically being too young and too unqualified for the office. They immediately undid most of Sulla's constitutional reforms, restored the tribune's power, and proved that the Roman system could no longer prevent ambitious men from bending rules when it suited their purposes. Still, the most ominous development was economic. Imperial wealth was concentrating in fewer and fewer hands. Urban mobs were demanding bread in circuses, and the traditional citizen-farmer class was disappearing. Roman society was dividing into plutocrats and plebs, with very little in between. Sound familiar? The final nail in the Republic's coffin came from an unexpected source: Spartacus, a gladiator who decided he'd rather die fighting for freedom than die entertaining Roman citizens. His slave revolt 7371 BCE terrified the Roman establishment, not because it threatened military defeat, but because it revealed how fundamentally unstable their society had become. Spartacus's army grew to over 100,000 escaped slaves and sympathizers, who defeated multiple Roman armies and held southern Italy for 2 years. The revolt was finally crushed by Crassus, who crucified 6,000 captured rebels along the Appian Way, 100 miles of crosses that served as a monument to Roman brutality and Roman fear. And yet, the Spartacus rebellion had demonstrated something that should have terrified thoughtful Romans. Their empire was built on foundations that could collapse if the oppressed ever organized effectively. Between slave revolts, popular politics, and military strongmen, the Republic was facing crises from every direction simultaneously. By 60 BCE, 3 ambitious men decided that instead of fighting each other for control of an increasingly ungovernable system, they'd work together to control it. Pompey brought military prestige, Crassus brought wealth, and Caesar brought political cunning. Together, they formed the first triumvirate, an unofficial alliance that would divide the Roman world between them. It was a perfectly Roman solution. Instead of reforming the system, they'd work around it. Instead of restoring republican government, they'd manage it more efficiently. Instead of addressing the underlying contradictions between empire and democracy, they'd simply make sure the right people were in charge. If you thought this arrangement would provide stability and good governance. WELO. Let's just say that partnerships between ambitious, powerful men with massive egos have a historically poor track record, especially when there's an entire empire at stake. Let's be honest. By 60 BCE, Gaius Julius Caesar was essentially having the most expensive midlife crisis in human history. At 40, he was deeply in debt, politically talented but not particularly accomplished, and watching men like Pompey and Crassus divide the Roman world between them while he scrambled for scraps. Sound familiar? It's like watching your college friends become billionaire tech CEOs while you're still trying to make rent. Except Caesar's solution to his problems would involve conquering most of Europe and fundamentally altering the course of Western civilization. Caesar's early career reads like a resume designed by someone who couldn't decide what they wanted to be when they grew up. He'd been a priest, a lawyer, a provincial administrator, and an urban magistrate responsible for public games. Where he spent so much money on gladiators shows that he basically invented deficit spending. To be fair, every job was just preparation for his real calling, becoming the most famous person who ever lived. The first triumvirate in 60 BCE was supposed to be a partnership of equals, but Caesar understood something his partners didn't. In any partnership, someone has to be the senior partner, and it might as well be him. Pompey had military glory, but was politically naive. Crassus had wealth but lacked vision. Caesar had ambition and the intelligence to turn opportunity into empire. His first break came when the triumvirate arranged for him to become consul in 59 BCE. Caesar used his year in office like a startup founder uses seed funding, aggressively expanding beyond what anyone thought possible. He pushed through land distribution for Pompey's veterans, confirmed Crassus's business deals, and secured for himself the governorship of Gaul for 5 years with 4 legions. Meanwhile, Caesar's consulship was so controversial that his colleague literally spent the year hiding in his house rather than deal with the political chaos. Caesar had essentially turned the highest office in the Republic into a one-man show, and his opponents could do nothing but complain loudly and promise revenge. But here's where Caesar's genius showed. Instead of waiting around Rome for his enemies to regroup, he left for Gaul in 58 BCE and didn't come back for 9 years. While Roman politicians argued about constitutional procedures, Caesar was busy conquering an area roughly the size of Texas and turning himself into the most successful military commander since Alexander the Great. The Gallic Wars, 5850 BCE, were Caesar's masterpiece. Part military campaign, part public relations exercise, and part ethnographic study. Caesar didn't just conquer Gaul. He wrote about conquering Gaul in third person, like he was narrating his own documentary. Caesar did this, Caesar did that. It was the ancient equivalent of live tweeting your own rise to greatness. And yet, the military achievements were genuinely extraordinary. Caesar conquered modern-day France, Belgium, parts of Germany, and even invaded Britain twice, something no Roman had attempted before. He defeated coalition armies, besieged fortified cities, and fought in terrain that Roman military doctrine said was unconquerable. Still, his real innovation wasn't tactical. It was logistical. Caesar understood that successful military campaigns depend on supply lines, local intelligence, and political relationships with conquered peoples. He didn't just defeat Gallic armies. He recruited Gallic soldiers, married into Gallic nobility, and created a system where resistance became pointless and collaboration profitable. Sound familiar? It's the Roman franchise model applied by someone who actually understood customer service. The Siege of Alesia in 52 BCE perfectly demonstrates Caesar's approach to impossible problems. Facing a Gallic coalition led by Vercingetorix, whose name alone should have warned Caesar this wouldn't be easy. Caesar found himself besieging a hilltop fortress while being besieged by a relief army. So he built 2 walls, one facing the city, one facing outward, and fought a 2-front siege that he somehow won through superior engineering and sheer bloody-minded determination. To be fair, Caesar's success in Gaul wasn't just military. It was economic. Gallic gold financed his legions. Gallic slaves worked Roman estates, and Gallic territory provided land for Roman veterans. Caesar had discovered that conquest could be profitable enough to fund more conquest, creating a self-sustaining cycle of expansion that made him both wealthy and indispensable. Meanwhile, back in Rome, the first triumvirate was falling apart, exactly as anyone who understood human nature would have predicted. Crassus decided he needed military glory to match Caesar and Pompey, so he invaded Parthia, modern Iran, with 7 legions and got himself and 20,000 Romans killed at the battle of Carrhae. The Parthians allegedly poured molten gold down his throat, which was either poetic justice or just really good PR for people who didn't like Roman imperialism. With Crassus dead, the triumvirate became a rivalry between Caesar and Pompey, with the Roman Senate desperately trying to play one against the other. Pompey had been Rome's greatest general before Caesar's Gallic campaigns, but watching someone else get all the glory and wealth from conquest was making him reconsider his life choices. The Senate, led by conservative politicians like Cato the Younger, saw an opportunity to use Pompey against Caesar. They declared Caesar a public enemy, demanded he disband his armies and return to Rome as a private citizen, and generally behaved like people who'd never read. They ruined their entire political careers. Caesar's response was characteristically direct. He marched his army to the Rubicon River, the boundary between Gaul and Italy, and face the choice that every ambitious person eventually faces. Follow the rules and probably lose everything, or break the rules and see what happens. According to legend, he said, Elia iacta est, the die is cast, and crossed the river with his legions. Crossing the Rubicon has become shorthand for making an irreversible decision. But let's be clear about what Caesar actually did. He committed treason, started a civil war, and bet his life that Roman citizens would choose him over the traditional government. It was the ultimate high-stakes gamble, and it worked because Caesar understood something his opponents didn't. People follow winners, not principles. The civil war that followed 4945 BCE was less a military contest than a demonstration of Caesar's political genius. Instead of fighting pitched battles against Pompey's larger armies, Caesar moved faster, struck where enemies were weak, and offered generous terms to anyone willing to switch sides. It was like watching a chess grandmaster play against talented amateurs. The outcome was never really in doubt. Pompey fled to Egypt, hoping to regroup and continue the fight. The Egyptians, being excellent readers of political winds, murdered him the moment he landed and sent his head to Caesar as a welcome gift. Caesar allegedly wept when he saw his former partner's severed head, which was either genuine emotion or excellent political theater. With Caesar, it was often both. And yet, Caesar's most famous relationship wasn't with Pompey or any Roman politician. It was with Cleopatra VII of Egypt, the last pharaoh and arguably the most intelligent woman in the ancient world. Their affair was part romance, part political alliance, and part mutual recognition that they were the two most extraordinary people in the Mediterranean. Cleopatra was everything. Roman propaganda said she wasn't, not particularly beautiful by conventional standards, but brilliant, educated, and charismatic enough to make powerful men completely rethink their life priorities. She spoke 9 languages, was trained in mathematics and philosophy, and ruled the wealthiest kingdom in the Mediterranean. Caesar, who collected talented people like some men collect art, was completely smitten. Their relationship produced a son, Caesarion, and a political partnership that terrified Roman conservatives who saw Egyptian wealth and sophistication as threats to traditional Roman virtue. The idea that Caesar might abandon Rome for Alexandria fed into every Roman fear about what empire was doing to their character. Still, Caesar returned to Rome in 46 BCE and celebrated triumphs that lasted for days and cost more than most nations' annual budgets. He displayed conquered treasures, paraded captured enemies, and generally threw the party of the century to demonstrate that following Caesar was more fun than opposing him. It was soft power politics before anyone had coined the term as dictator. Caesar proved that he was as gifted at administration as he was at conquest. He reformed the calendar, giving us the year we still use, reorganized provincial government, extended citizenship to Gauls and Spaniards, and launched public works, projects that provided employment and improved infrastructure. To be fair, he was basically governing like someone who expected to be in charge for decades. And yet, Caesar's greatest political mistake was also his most human one. He couldn't resist showing off. He accepted unprecedented honors, allowed statues of himself to be placed in temples, and generally behaved like someone who'd forgotten that Romans had murdered their last king for being too kingly. Sound familiar? Success often contains the seeds of its own destruction. The conspiracy against Caesar formed among senators who convinced themselves they were saving the Republic, but who were really just angry that one man had outplayed them all. Led by Marcus Brutus, descendant of the founder of the Republic, and Gaius Cassius, they planned Caesar's assassination with the kind of elaborate symbolism that Romans loved and the kind of political naivety that would have impressed nobody. On March 15th, 44 BCE, the Ides of March, Caesar was stabbed 23 times by senators. who thought killing one man would restore Republican government. It was like trying to fix a broken system by unplugging it and plugging it back in. Except the system was the most powerful empire in the world, and unplugging it meant civil war. Caesar's last words, according to Shakespeare, were, "Et tu, Brute?" And you, Brutus? Expressing betrayal by his adoptive son. According to Roman historians, he said nothing at all, just pulled his toga over his face when he saw Brutus among his attackers. Either way, the message was clear. Even Caesar hadn't seen this coming. The assassins expected Romans to celebrate their liberation from tyranny. Instead, Mark Antony reads Caesar's will publicly, revealing that Caesar had left money to every Roman citizen and his gardens to the city as a public park. The crowd that had been applauding the conspirators suddenly wanted to know why they'd murdered someone who'd been so generous to ordinary people. Caesar's funeral became a riot. His supporters demanded vengeance, and his heir, an 18-year-old grandnephew, named Octavian, arrived in Rome with Caesar's name, Caesar's money, and Caesar's political legacy. The conspirators had killed Caesar, but created Caesarism, and the republic they'd tried to save was about to be buried along with the man they'd murdered. If you thought Caesar's death would end the crisis of the Roman Republic, think again. The only thing more dangerous than Caesar alive was Caesar dead, because now he was a martyr, a symbol, and a precedent for how one man could become more important than the state itself. Meanwhile, in 44 BCE, an 18-year-old named Gaius Octavius was studying rhetoric in Greece when he received news that would change his life and world history. His great-uncle Julius Caesar was dead, and Caesar's will named him as primary heir and adopted son. That's right, the future first emperor of Rome learned about his destiny the same way most teenagers learn about family drama, through urgent, confusing messages that arrived at the worst possible moment. Let's be clear about Octavian's situation. He was inheriting Caesar's name, Caesar's wealth, and Caesar's political problems from men who'd just proven they were willing to murder anyone who threatened their vision of Republican government. Sound familiar? It's like being promoted to CEO of a company where the previous CEO was assassinated by the board of directors, who are now pretending everything is fine and asking if you'd like some T-dot to be fair. Most people in Octavian's position would have quietly declined the inheritance, changed their name, and moved to a nice villa somewhere far from Rome. Octavian instead traveled to Rome, legally adopted Caesar's name, becoming Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, and began demanding that the conspirators face justice for murdering his adoptive father. At 18, he was playing a political game that had killed experienced politicians, and somehow he was winning. Octavian's secret weapon wasn't military genius or popular charisma. It was something far more dangerous in Roman politics: patience. While Mark Antony and the conspirators fought over Caesar's immediate legacy, Octavian quietly built relationships with Caesar's veterans, courted popular support, and waited for his enemies to make mistakes. And yet, his most brilliant move was realizing that in a world where everyone was trying to be the next Caesar, success would come to whoever could make people forget. They wanted a republic in the first place. The immediate crisis came from Mark Antony, Caesar's lieutenant and consul, who assumed he'd inherit Caesar's political position, along with Caesar's papers and property. Antony was everything Octavian wasn't: charismatic, experienced, militarily proven, and completely convinced that 18-year-olds should be seen and not heard in serious politics. Still, Antony underestimated something crucial in Roman politics. Legal adoption meant more than personal relationships, and Caesar's name carried more weight than Caesar's friends. The power struggle between Antony and Octavian played out over months of political maneuvering that would have impressed Machiavelli. Both claimed to represent Caesar's legacy, both courted the same supporters, and both discovered that sharing power was harder than seizing it. Meanwhile, the Senate tried to play them against each other while the conspirators lurked in the background, probably wondering if murdering Caesar had actually solved any of their problems. By 43 BCE, the situation had clarified into the kind of three-way political crisis that Romans specialized in creating. Antony controlled most of Caesar's supporters, Octavian controlled Caesar's name and money, and the conspirators controlled the moral high ground, which, in Roman politics, was worth approximately nothing. The obvious solution was for everyone to form an alliance, divide the Roman world between them, and postpone the inevitable showdown until they'd eliminated their common enemies. Enter the second triumvirate: Antony, Octavian, and Marcus Lepus, Caesar's former lieutenant, who brought enough legions to matter, but not enough political skill to survive long-term. Unlike the first triumvirate, which was an informal agreement, this one was official, legal, and came with government-sanctioned powers to reform the state. It was like a hostile corporate takeover, except the corporation was the Roman Republic. And the takeover involved actual executions. The triumvirs immediately published prescription lists that made Sulla's purges look restrained. They marked 300 senators and 2,000 equestrians for death, confiscated their property, and essentially declared open season on anyone who'd oppose Caesar or might oppose them. Among the victims was Cicero, Rome's greatest orator, and Antony's personal enemy, whose hands and head were nailed to the speaker's platform in the forum as a warning to future critics. If you thought this bloodbath would restore political stability, think again. The prescriptions eliminated immediate opposition, but created long-term problems that would haunt the triumvirate. They demonstrated that Roman citizenship meant nothing when powerful men wanted your property, that the law existed only at the pleasure of whoever controlled the armies, and that republican institutions were just decorative elements in what was becoming a military dictatorship. Meanwhile, the conspirators had fled to the eastern provinces and were raising armies to restore the Republic, or at least their version of it. Brutus and Cassius controlled substantial resources and territory, commanded respect among Romans who still believed in constitutional government, and represented the last hope for anyone who thought Caesar's assassination might actually lead to political reform. The showdown came at Philippi in 42 BCE, where Antony and Octavian led 28 legions against Brutus and Cassius's 19 legions in a battle that would determine whether Rome remained a republic or became an empire. It was like the Super Bowl of ancient politics, except with higher stakes and more actual death. The battle itself was typically Roman in its complexity. Antony defeated Cassius, while Brutus defeated Octavian, leading both Cassius and Brutus to commit suicide based on incomplete information about the overall battle's outcome. It was a victory for the triumvirate, but the kind of victory that raised questions about whether anyone really knew what they were fighting for any more. With the conspirators dead, the triumvirate divided the Roman world. Antony got the wealthy eastern provinces, Octavian got Italy and the West, and Lepidus got Africa, which everyone understood was the consolation prize. It was supposed to be a permanent arrangement, but anyone who'd been paying attention to Roman politics knew that three ambitious men couldn't share one empire indefinitely. The partnership began to fracture almost immediately, largely because Antony made the same mistake as so many successful men before him. He fell in love with the wrong woman. His affair with Cleopatra wasn't just romantic. It was political dynamite that Octavian would exploit with the skill of someone who understood that in politics, perception matters more than reality. To be fair, Antony's relationship with Cleopatra made perfect strategic sense. Egypt was the wealthiest province in the Mediterranean. Cleopatra was an experienced ruler who could provide resources and legitimacy, and their partnership created a power base that might have dominated the Roman world. Still, Roman public opinion saw it differently. Antony was abandoning Roman values for foreign luxury, choosing an Egyptian queen over Roman honor, and generally behaving like someone who'd been seduced by enemy agents. Octavian, meanwhile, was building his power base through careful attention to Roman sensibilities that Antony seemed to be abandoning. He married Livia, creating a political alliance with one of Rome's most prominent families, promoted traditional Roman values in his public statements, and generally positioned himself as the defender of Roman civilization against foreign corruption. The propaganda war between Octavian and Antony was as important as their military preparations. Octavian portrayed himself as defending Rome against Eastern decadence, while Antony claimed to represent Caesar's true legacy against a usurper who'd stolen the name without earning it. Both sides published pamphlets, commissioned poetry, and generally conducted the first modern political campaign in human history. By 32 BCE, the partnership was over in all but name. Octavian convinced the Senate to declare war against Cleopatra, carefully avoiding declaring war against Antony directly, since that would make it a civil war rather than a foreign conflict. And both sides began mobilizing for a final showdown that would determine the future of the Roman world. The Battle of Actium in 31 BC was less a military engagement than a political statement. Octavian's fleet, commanded by Marcus Agrippa, faced Antony and Cleopatra's combined forces in a naval battle that ended when Cleopatra's ships retreated, and Antony followed her rather than continuing to fight. Whether this was cowardice, love, or strategic retreat depends on which ancient source you believe. But the result was clear. Octavian had won. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, where they spent a year trying to negotiate or fight their way out of inevitable defeat. Both committed suicide rather than face capture, and Octavian arrived in Alexandria as master of the entire Roman world. At 32, he controlled more territory and wealth than any individual in human history, and he'd done it by being more patient, more calculating, and more politically astute than anyone else in a generation of brilliant politicians. And yet, Octavian's greatest challenge wasn't military or political. It was constitutional. He now held the same kind of power that had gotten Caesar assassinated, controlled the same kind of resources that had made Antony seem like a threat to Roman values, and faced the same fundamental question that had destroyed the Republic. How? Do you exercise absolute power in a system that's supposed to prevent any individual from having absolute power? Octavian's solution was characteristically brilliant. He gave up all his extraordinary powers and restored the Republic. Of course, he did it in a way that ensured the Senate would immediately give him different powers that were technically constitutional, but practically unlimited. In 27 BCE, he became Augustus, the revered one, and established the Roman Empire while pretending he'd restored republican government. Augustus ruled for 45 years and transformed every aspect of Roman life while maintaining the fiction that he was just a regular citizen who happened to hold various traditional offices simultaneously. He reformed the military, reorganized provincial administration, rebuilt Rome's infrastructure, and established a system of government that would last for centuries. To be fair, he'd learned from Caesar's mistake. If you're going to be a dictator, don't look like one. Still, Augustus's greatest achievement was cultural. He made imperialism seem like destiny, autocracy seem like efficiency, and the end of the Republic seem like evolution rather than revolution. By the time he died in 14 CE, Romans had forgotten what it felt like to choose their own leaders and had learned to see the emperor as the natural head of the state, rather than an accident of civil war. If you thought Augustus's success would ensure a smooth transition to the next generation, let's just say that the Julio-Claudian dynasty was about to provide some of the most spectacular examples of what happens when unlimited power meets human psychology. Meanwhile, By 14 CE, Augustus had established a system so successful that it survived being inherited by some of the most psychologically interesting individuals in human history. Let's be clear about what Augustus had created. A government where one person held ultimate authority but exercised it through traditional institutions, creating the illusion of constitutional rule while ensuring that real power could never be challenged. Sound familiar? It's like designing the perfect corporate structure and then realizing your successors might include a sociopath, a paranoid recluse, and someone who thinks their horse should be promoted to middle management. Tiberius, Augustus's stepson and reluctant heir, ruled from 1437 CE and demonstrated that being extremely competent at your job doesn't necessarily make you good at it. Tiberius was everything Romans claimed to want in a leader: experienced, fiscally responsible, militarily proven, and completely uninterested in the glamorous aspects of imperial power. And yet, he was so socially awkward and politically tone-deaf that he made effective governance look like a personality disorder. To be fair, Tiberius faced an impossible situation. Augustus had been beloved because he'd ended the civil wars, brought peace, and established prosperity while maintaining republican forms. Tiberius inherited all the responsibilities of imperial power, but none of the revolutionary legitimacy that had made Augustus acceptable. He was like a CEO who takes over from the company's charismatic founder. Anything he did would be compared unfavorably to his predecessor. Tiberius's solution was to govern efficiently but joylessly, like someone completing a difficult homework assignment that he'd never wanted in the first place. He balanced the budget, maintained the borders, and kept the administration running smoothly while making it clear that he'd rather be doing literally anything else. Still, his greatest mistake was trusting Sejanus, the Praetorian prefect, who basically ran the government while Tiberius retreated to Capri and tried to pretend the empire could manage itself. Sejanus used his position to eliminate potential rivals, concentrate power in his own hands, and generally behave like someone who confused deputy emperor with actual emperor. When Tiberius finally realized what was happening, his response was characteristically Roman. He had Sejanus and all his supporters murdered in a purge that made loyalty to the emperor seem like the only safe political position. By the time Tiberius died in 37 CE, he'd established two dangerous precedents: that emperors could delegate real authority to subordinates, and that fear was an acceptable substitute for popularity in maintaining imperial power. His reign was successful by most objective measures, but created an atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion that would haunt his successors. Enter Gaius, known to history as Caligula, who proved that giving unlimited power to someone with severe mental health issues was exactly as bad an idea as it sounds. Caligula ruled from 37 to 41 CE and managed to nearly bankrupt the empire, terrorize the aristocracy, and convince everyone that maybe the Republic hadn't been such a terrible system after all. Caligula started his reign as Rome's most popular emperor. In decades, he was young, charismatic, generous with public entertainment, and seemed to represent the return to the more accessible style of Augustus after Tiberius's gloomy efficiency. For about a year, Romans congratulated themselves on having such a promising leader. If you thought this would last, you clearly haven't been paying attention to the relationship between power and mental stability in the Julio-Claudian family. Let's be honest about what happened next. Caligula went completely insane, and because he was emperor, his insanity became public policy. He declared himself a living god, demanded worship from Roman citizens, and allegedly made his horse a consul, though historians debate whether this actually happened or was just a threat designed to humiliate the Senate. He built bridges across bays so he could ride his horse over water, held conversations with statues of Jupiter, and generally behaved like someone whose grip on reality had been replaced by unlimited power and probable syphilis. Meanwhile, Caligula's fiscal policy consisted of spending money on whatever occurred to him at any given moment. He gave massive bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, funded elaborate public games, built unnecessary public works, and distributed so much money to citizens that he bankrupted the imperial treasury in less than 2 years. It was like watching someone win the lottery and immediately spend it all on gold-plated everything. And yet, Caligula's real innovation was administrative sadism. He didn't just rule badly. He seemed to enjoy making other people miserable. He forced senators to run beside his chariot, made them kiss his feet in public, and generally treated the Roman aristocracy like entertainment for his personal amusement. Sound familiar? It's what happens when someone with narcissistic personality disorder gets access to unlimited power and discovers that humiliating other people is fun. The conspiracy that killed Caligula in 41 CE included Praetorian guards, senators, and basically anyone who'd gotten tired of living in a state run like the world's most expensive psychiatric facility. They stabbed him 30 times in a theater corridor, killed his wife, and murdered his daughter by smashing her head against a wall. It was brutal even by Roman standards, but by that point, most people were just relieved that the nightmare was over. Of course, assassinating an emperor left the conspirators with a small problem. They hadn't planned what to do next. The Praetorian Guard solved this by finding Claudius, Caligula's uncle, hiding behind a curtain in the palace and declaring him emperor before anyone else could object. It was like a military coup executed by people who were making it up as they went along. Claudius ruled from 4154 CE and proved that sometimes the best leaders are people who never wanted the job in the first place. He was physically disabled, socially awkward, and had spent most of his life being ignored by his family as an embarrassing relative, who was kept around but never taken seriously. Still, he turned out to be exactly what the empire needed. Someone who understood that good governance was more important than imperial glamour. To be fair, Claudius was probably the most qualified emperor since Augustus. He was a serious historian, an experienced administrator, and someone who'd observed imperial politics from the outside long enough to understand how the system actually worked. His physical disabilities had protected him from the kind of palace intrigue that destroyed other Julio-Claudians, and his scholarly interests meant he approached problems analytically rather than emotionally. Claudius conquered Britain, extended citizenship throughout the provinces, reformed the legal system, and generally demonstrated that effective leadership was about competent administration rather than charismatic performance. He also married his niece Agrippina, who convinced him to adopt her son Nero as his heir instead of his own biological son Britannicus. This decision would prove to be as catastrophic as it sounds. Agrippina was everything Romans expected from ambitious imperial women, intelligent, ruthless, and completely convinced that she should be ruling the empire instead of just influencing whoever happened to be emperor. She allegedly poisoned Claudius in 54 CE to ensure Nero's succession, making her one of the most successful political operators in Roman history and one of the most dangerous mothers-in-law in human experience. Nero ruled from 54 to 68 CE and managed to combine Caligula's megalomania with genuine artistic talent, creating a reign that was simultaneously creative and catastrophic. Nero actually believed he was a gifted performer and spent enormous amounts of time and imperial resources on his music, poetry, and theatrical performances. Meanwhile, the empire was running itself through a combination of institutional momentum and competent subordinates who understood that their job was to keep things functioning while the emperor pursued his hobbies. Let's be clear about Nero's artistic ambitions. He wasn't just dabbling in the arts as a royal pastime. He genuinely thought he was talented enough to compete professionally, forced audiences to listen to his performances, and banned people from leaving during his concerts. It was like having a CEO who insists on performing his original poetry at board meetings and gets offended when people check their phones. Still, Nero's real problems were political, not artistic. He murdered his mother Agrippina, who'd been trying to control him through emotional manipulation and political pressure, killed his wife Octavia to marry his mistress Poppaea, and generally eliminated anyone who reminded him that emperors were supposed to serve the state rather than treat it as personal property. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE gave Nero his opportunity for urban renewal on a massive scale. While the story that he fiddled while Rome burned is almost certainly false, fiddles hadn't been invented yet. Nero did use the fire as an excuse to build his Golden House, a palace complex that covered about a third of the city and featured a 120-foot statue of himself. It was like responding to a natural disaster by building yourself a theme park. Meanwhile, Nero's spending on public entertainment, architectural projects, and his own artistic career was bankrupting the empire faster than anyone thought possible. He debased the currency, increased taxes, and confiscated property from wealthy citizens to fund his projects. By 68 CE, he managed to unite the Senate, the army, and the people in the belief that literally anyone would be a better emperor. The revolt that ended Nero's reign started in Gaul and spread throughout the provinces as Romulus. Governors decided they'd rather rebel than explain to their troops why they were fighting to protect an emperor who thought he was a rock star. Nero fled Rome and committed suicide rather than face capture, allegedly saying, "What an artist dies in me," as his last words. It was perfectly on brand for someone who'd confused ruling an empire with starring in his own performance art piece. Nero's death ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty and created a succession crisis that revealed how fragile the imperial system actually was. Without a clear heir, different armies began proclaiming their own candidates for emperor, leading to the year of four emperors 6869 CE, a civil war that demonstrated that the Pax Romana depended entirely on having someone in charge who could command universal respect. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian each claimed imperial power in rapid succession, with each transition involving either assassination or military defeat. It was like a deadly game of musical chairs where the music kept stopping and starting, and the prize was control of the most powerful empire in the world. And yet, the crisis also demonstrated the empire's fundamental stability. Despite having four different emperors in 1 year, provincial administration continued. Trade routes remained open, and the basic structures of Roman government kept functioning. The empire had become too large and complex to collapse just because the person at the top kept changing. Vespasian finally restored order by being more practical and less dramatic than his predecessors. He was a career soldier who understood that the emperor's job was to keep the empire running efficiently, not to provide entertainment or pursue personal artistic ambitions. His reign, 69 to 79 CE, marked the beginning of the Flavian dynasty and a return to the competent, unglamorous administration that made the empire actually work. Still, the Julio-Claudian period had established some important precedents: that emperors were accountable to no one but themselves, that imperial power could survive almost any kind of personal dysfunction, and that the Roman system was robust enough to function even when the people running it were clearly unqualified for the responsibility. Sound familiar? It's a lesson that every subsequent empire would learn the hard way. If you thought the next dynasty would learn from these examples and produce more stable, competent leaders, well, you're actually right, mostly. But even competent emperors would face the fundamental challenge that had destroyed the Republic. How do you maintain civic virtue and constitutional government when you're running a global empire that depends on military force and imperial bureaucracy? Meanwhile, by 96 CE, Romans had learned some valuable lessons about imperial succession through approximately a century of trial and error that had featured more errors than most civilizations could survive. The Domitian assassination, the last of the Flavian emperors, had demonstrated once again that killing emperors was easier than finding good replacements. But this time, the Senate and remaining officials managed to choose someone who actually understood the job description. Nerva ruled for only 2 years, 96 to 98 CE. But his most important decision was adopting Trajan as his successor rather than relying on biological inheritance. Let's be clear about what this meant. Instead of the genetic lottery that had given Rome Caligula and Nero, the empire would be governed by people chosen for competence rather than bloodline. It was like switching from monarchy to meritocracy. Except the meritocracy still involved unlimited power and no checks on imperial authority. Trajan, 98 to 117 CE, was everything Romans thought an emperor should be. Militarily successful, administratively competent, personally accessible, and completely uninterested in the kind of artistic or religious experiments that had made his predecessors so memorably terrible. He was also the first emperor born outside Italy. He was Spanish, proving that Roman citizenship had evolved beyond ethnic identity into something approaching modern nationality. And yet, Trajan's real achievement was understanding that successful emperors needed to balance expansion with consolidation, military glory with domestic prosperity, and imperial authority with respect for traditional Roman values. He conquered Dacia, modern Romania, invaded Parthia, and expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent while also funding massive public works, projects that employed citizens and beautified Rome. Trajan's column, which still stands in Rome today, perfectly captures his approach to imperial leadership. It's a 125-foot monument covered with detailed reliefs showing his Dacian campaigns, combining military propaganda with artistic achievement and civic pride. It was like commissioning a blockbuster movie about your own career, except the movie was carved in stone and designed to last forever. To be fair, Trajan's military successes weren't just about conquest. They were about demonstrating that Roman power could still grow rather than simply maintain what previous generations had achieved. The Dacian Wars brought enormous wealth to Rome. Dacian gold mines financed public works for decades, while the Parthian campaign showed that Rome could project power even against the other great empire of the ancient world. Still, Trajan's most important innovation was administrative. He created a system of provincial governors who were accountable to the emperor rather than to local elites, established regular communication between Rome and distant territories, and developed legal procedures that protected provincial citizens from abuse by Roman officials. It was like creating the first multinational corporation with actual customer service standards. Meanwhile, Trajan's domestic policies demonstrated that imperial authority could be used for genuinely beneficial purposes. His Alimenta program provided subsidies for poor children throughout Italy. His public works employed thousands of citizens, and his legal reforms protected the rights of slaves and women. Sound familiar? It's what competent government looks like when it has adequate resources and intelligent leadership. When Trajan died in 117 CE during his Parthian campaign, he left the empire at its greatest territorial extent, but also facing the practical limits of expansion. His successor, Hadrian, understood something that many imperial leaders never learn. Sometimes the most important decision is knowing when to stop. Hadrian, 117 to 138 CE, was arguably the most intellectually curious emperor in Roman history. A man who spoke Greek fluently, wrote poetry, practiced architecture, and traveled throughout the empire not as a conqueror, but but as someone genuinely interested in understanding what he was governing. He was like a Renaissance prince born 1,400 years early, except with the resources of a global empire to support his interests. Hadrian's most famous achievement is the wall across northern Britain that still bears his name, but the wall represents something more important than just frontier defense. Hadrian's Wall marked the moment when Rome officially acknowledged that there were limits to expansion, that some territories weren't worth conquering, and some peoples were better left outside the empire than absorbed into it. And yet, Hadrian's real genius was cultural. He understood that governing a diverse empire required respecting local traditions while promoting common Roman values, protecting regional identities while encouraging imperial loyalty. His travels throughout the provinces weren't just inspection. Tours. They were attempts to understand how Roman law and administration could adapt to local conditions without losing their essential character. The reconstruction of Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina demonstrates both Hadrian's vision and its limitations. After the Bar Kokhba revolt, 132 to 135 CE, Hadrian rebuilt the destroyed city as a Roman colony with classical architecture, pagan temples, and no Jewish population. It was urban planning as cultural transformation, and while it created a beautiful city, it also generated resentment that would influence Jewish-Roman relations for centuries. Still, Hadrian's administrative reforms created the framework for imperial government that would last for hundreds of years. He codified Roman law, professionalized the imperial bureaucracy, and established procedures for provincial administration that protected both Roman interests and local autonomy. It was like creating an operating system for empire that could run on any hardware. Antoninus Pius, 138 to 161 CE, inherited Hadrian's achievements and did something remarkably unusual for a Roman emperor. He left well enough alone. His 23-year reign was so peaceful and prosperous that historians struggle to find dramatic events to write about. He didn't start major wars, didn't build massive monuments, and didn't implement revolutionary reforms. Of course, this made him one of Rome's most successful emperors, thought to be fair. Antoninus Pius understood something that many leaders never learn: that maintaining success is often harder than achieving it in the first place. He focused on judicial reform, provincial administration, and fiscal responsibility, while avoiding the kind of dramatic gestures that might have destabilized the system he'd inherited. Meanwhile, the empire was reaching a level of prosperity and cultural achievement that wouldn't be matched again until the modern era. Roman roads connected Britain to Mesopotamia. Roman law protected citizens from Spain to Syria. And Roman citizenship meant something valuable whether you lived in Gaul or Egypt. It was globalization before anyone had invented the term. Marcus Aurelius, 161 to 180 CE, was the last of the 5 good emperors, and perhaps the most psychologically complex leader in Roman history. He was a Stoic philosopher who genuinely believed in duty, virtue, and service to others. But he spent most of his reign fighting wars on multiple frontiers, against enemies who didn't share his philosophical commitments to rational discourse and peaceful coexistence. Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, written during military campaigns on the Danube frontier, reveal someone trying to reconcile philosophical idealism with political reality. He believed in human dignity, but ordered mass executions, promoted rational thought but fought religious wars, and sought inner peace while commanding armies in brutal frontier conflicts. Sound familiar? It's what happens when thoughtful people inherit systems that require them to do terrible things for good reasons. And yet, Marcus Aurelius's reign marked the beginning of problems that would eventually destroy the imperial system. He'd tried so hard to preserve. Germanic tribes were pressing against the Danube frontier with increasing intensity. The Antonine Plague, possibly smallpox, was devastating urban populations throughout the empire, and the cost of defending distant borders was straining imperial finances. Still, the most ominous development was succession. Marcus Aurelius broke the adoptive system that had produced 5 consecutive competent emperors and left the throne to his biological son Commodus. It was like a successful company deciding to replace merit-based promotion with hereditary management. Predictably disastrous, but somehow inevitable. Let's be honest about what the Antonine period represented. It was the closest any large-scale political system had come to combining effective government with decent treatment of citizens. Roman law protected individual rights, Roman administration provided essential services, and Roman citizenship offered opportunities for advancement regardless of ethnic background. To be fair, this system still depended on slavery, excluded women from political participation, and maintained itself through military force, but it was remarkably progressive by ancient standards. Daily life in Antonine Rome reveals a society that had solved many basic problems of urban civilization. Roman engineering provided clean water through aqueducts, removed waste through sewers, and connected distant territories through roads that remained functional for centuries after the empire's collapse. Roman law offered legal protections and dispute resolution procedures that many modern societies would envy. The gladiatorial games that modern people associate with Roman brutality were actually sophisticated entertainment industries that employed thousands of people and provided social mobility for successful performers. Most gladiators were professionals who fought according to established rules with medical support and retirement benefits. It was violent entertainment, but it was also regulated violence in a world where unregulated violence was the norm. Meanwhile, Roman religious tolerance allowed local deities to coexist with traditional Roman gods, creating a polytheistic system that accommodated regional diversity while promoting imperial unity. The imperial cult provided a focus for political loyalty without requiring abandonment of local religious traditions. It was like having a unifying civic religion that didn't interfere with personal spiritual beliefs. And yet, by 180 CE, careful observers might have noticed that the system was showing signs of strain. The frontiers required increasing military resources to defend. The urban population was becoming dependent on government subsidies, and the citizen soldiers who had built the empire were being replaced by barbarian mercenaries who fought for pay rather than patriotic duty. Marcus Aurelius's death in 180 CE marked the end of the Pax Romana and the beginning of a crisis that would test whether Roman institutions could survive the pressures that imperial success had created. The empire was still enormously wealthy, militarily powerful, and administratively sophisticated, but it was also facing challenges that competent emperors and efficient bureaucracy might not be able to solve. If you thought the next generation of leaders would build on Antonine achievements and solve these emerging problems through the same kind of rational administration that had made the empire successful, well, let's just say that Commodus had very different ideas about what emperors were supposed to do with their time and power. Meanwhile, in 180 CE, Commodus inherited the most powerful and prosperous empire in human history, and immediately set about proving that good parenting and unlimited power don't necessarily produce good leaders. Let's be clear about what Marcus Aurelius had bequeathed to his son: a stable government, full treasury, competent bureaucracy, and the goodwill of citizens who'd experienced nearly a century of peace and prosperity. Sound familiar? It's like inheriting a successful family business and deciding your first priority should be turning it into a personal entertainment venue. Commodus, 180 to 192 CE, managed to combine Nero's megalomania with Caligula's detachment from reality, except instead of thinking he was an artist or a god, he believed he was a gladiator. That's right. The Emperor of Rome spent his time fighting in the arena, renaming months of the year after himself, and generally behaving like someone who'd confused ruling an empire with starring in his own reality TV show. To be fair, Commodus's gladiatorial performances weren't completely without precedent. Roman emperors had always been expected to demonstrate physical courage and military prowess. Still, there's a difference between leading armies and fighting wild animals for public entertainment while dressed as Hercules. It was like a modern head of state deciding that their primary responsibility was competing in professional wrestling. And yet, Commodus's real problem wasn't his hobby. It was his complete disinterest in the boring parts of imperial administration that actually made the empire function. He delegated real authority to praetorian prefects and imperial freedmen, who used their positions to enrich themselves while ignoring the kind of frontier pressures and administrative challenges that required imperial attention. Meanwhile, the empire was facing its first serious external pressures since the Antonine period began. Germanic tribes were organizing into larger coalitions. Parthia was testing Roman defenses in the east, and the costs of maintaining frontier security were growing faster than imperial revenues. These weren't existential threats yet, but they required the kind of sustained attention that Commodus was too busy fighting lions to provide. The conspiracy that killed Commodus in 192 CE included his mistress, his athletic trainer, and the praetorian prefect, basically everyone who had to deal with him on a daily basis. They strangled him in his bath, which was probably more dignified than he deserved, but less creative than he might have appreciated. Still, killing an emperor without planning a succession created the same problem that had plagued Rome since. Julius Caesar. What happens next? What happened next was the year of 5 emperors, 193 CE, which proved that the lessons of 69 CE hadn't been learned, and that Roman generals were still willing to fight civil wars for the privilege of trying to solve unsolvable problems. Pertinax, Didius Julianus, Pescennius Niger, Clodius Albinus, and finally Septimius Severus each claimed imperial authority, leading to conflicts that devastated Italy and reminded everyone why political stability was more important than constitutional purity. Septimius Severus, 193 to 211 CE, restored order by being more ruthless than his opponents and more realistic about what it would take to maintain imperial power in an increasingly dangerous world. He doubled military pay, expanded the legions, and essentially transformed Rome from a citizen empire into a military state where the army's needs took priority over civilian preferences. Let's be honest about what Severus accomplished. He solved the immediate crisis through military efficiency and political brutality, but he also fundamentally altered the relationship between emperor and citizens. Previous emperors had ruled through a combination of traditional authority and popular consent. Severus ruled through military force and made it clear that imperial power came from the loyalty of soldiers rather than the approval of citizens. The Severan dynasty, 193 to 235 CE, maintained stability through increasingly authoritarian methods. That sacrificed republican traditions for imperial effectiveness. Caracalla extended citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire in 212 CE, which sounds progressive, but was actually a tax measure designed to increase revenues. Elagabalus imported Syrian religious practices and sexual customs that scandalized traditional Romans. Alexander Severus tried to restore traditional government but was murdered by his own soldiers when his diplomatic approach to Germanic tribes was seen as weakness. And yet, the real crisis wasn't political. It was systemic. The empire had grown. Too large to govern efficiently, too expensive to maintain indefinitely, and too complex to reform without risking collapse. Military expenses were consuming increasing percentages of imperial revenues. Urban populations were becoming dependent on government subsidies, and the citizen farmer class that had once provided soldiers and taxes was disappearing. Meanwhile, External pressures were intensifying in ways that traditional Roman responses couldn't address. The Germanic tribes weren't just raiding for loot anymore. They were migrating en masse due to population pressure and climate change, seeking new territories rather than temporary plunder. The Sassanid Empire had replaced Parthia in the east and was more militarily effective and ideologically hostile to Roman influence than its predecessor. The crisis of the 3rd century, 235 to 284 CE, demonstrated what happens when a political system faces more challenges than it can solve simultaneously. In 50 years, the empire had 26 emperors, most of whom died violent deaths. Provinces declared independence. Barbarian invasions penetrated deep into imperial territory, and the economy collapsed as currency debasement made money worthless. If you thought Roman institutions would provide stability during this crisis, think again. The Senate became irrelevant as emperors were chosen by armies rather than constitutional procedures. Provincial governors became warlords who fought each other rather than external enemies. Cities were abandoned as trade routes became unsafe, and tax collection became impossible. Still, the most revealing aspect of the 3rd century crisis was how localized it remained. While the central government collapsed, individual provinces, cities, and regions continued to function using Roman law, Roman administrative practices, and Roman cultural institutions. The empire had become too deeply embedded in daily life to disappear just because the people nominally in charge kept killing each other. The Gallic Empire, 260 to 274 CE, perfectly illustrates this paradox. When central authority collapsed, the northwestern provinces declared independence under Postumus and maintained Roman government, Roman law, and Roman military organization while rejecting imperial authority. They weren't abandoning Roman civilization. They were preserving it against emperors who seemed more interested in civil war than effective governance. Meanwhile, Queen Zenobia of Palmyra created an Eastern empire that controlled Egypt, Syria, and much of Asia Minor while maintaining Roman administrative structures and cultural practices. Like the Gallic Empire, Palmyra represented Roman civilization continuing without Roman emperors rather than anti-Roman rebellion. To be fair, both breakaway empires were eventually reconquered by Aurelian, 270 to 275 CE, who demonstrated that military competence could still restore imperial unity, even after decades of chaos. Still, the fact that Roman territories could maintain Roman civilization independently of central authority suggested that the empire had become something more than just a political system held together by military force. And yet, the economic devastation of the 3rd century crisis created problems that military solutions couldn't address. Inflation had made Roman currency nearly worthless. Trade had declined due to insecurity, and urban populations had been devastated by plague, warfare, and economic collapse. The empire that Diocletian inherited in 284 CE was still enormous and potentially powerful, but it bore little resemblance to the prosperous, confident state that Marcus Aurelius had governed. The crisis had also demonstrated that traditional Roman solutions, military conquest, administrative efficiency, and elite consensus were inadequate for the challenges the empire now faced. Success would require fundamental changes in government structure, economic policy, and cultural identity that would transform Roman civilization as completely as Augustus had transformed the Republic. Sound familiar? Every successful civilization eventually faces the choice between adaptation and decline, between preserving traditional forms and developing new capabilities. The 3rd century crisis had shown that preservation wasn't possible. The question was whether transformation would be. Meanwhile, by 284 CE, the Roman Empire was like a patient in intensive care, still alive, but requiring radical treatment to survive. Enter Diocletian, who took one look at the chaos and decided that the problem wasn't that Rome had too much government, but that it didn't have enough. His solution was to essentially quadruple the size of the imperial administration and divide the empire into manageable pieces, creating the Tetrarchy, a system where 4 emperors share power across different regions. Let's be clear about what Diocletian accomplished. He stabilized the frontiers, reformed the currency, reorganized the military, and created a bureaucratic system so complex that it took a Harvard MBA to understand it. Okay, MBAs didn't exist yet, but you get the idea. To be fair, his reforms worked. The empire stopped collapsing and began functioning again. Still, the price of stability was the complete transformation of Roman government from a principate that maintained republican forms into an absolute monarchy that made no pretense of constitutional limits. Diocletian's edict on maximum prices, 301 CE, perfectly illustrates both his administrative ambition and its limitations. Faced with inflation caused by currency debasement, he decided to fix prices for everything from wheat to legal services throughout the empire. It was like trying to control market forces through spreadsheet management. Theoretically rational, but practically impossible to enforce across millions of square miles and tens of millions of people. And yet, Diocletian's most historically significant decision wasn't administrative. It was religious. The Great Persecution 303-311 CE was the Roman Empire's final, systematic attempt to eliminate Christianity through state violence. Diocletian ordered the destruction of Christian churches, the burning of Christian scriptures, and the execution of Christians who refused to sacrifice to traditional Roman gods. It was like trying to solve a cultural problem through administrative efficiency. Sound familiar? Diocletian had identified Christianity as a threat to traditional Roman values and imperial unity, and his solution was characteristically Roman. If something threatens the state, you eliminate it through organized violence. What he didn't understand was that Christianity had already become too widespread and too deeply rooted to destroy through persecution. By the early 4th century, Christianity had evolved from a small Jewish sect into a religious movement that crossed ethnic, social, and geographic boundaries throughout the empire. Christian communities existed in every major city. Christian ideas influenced educated elites, and Christian organization provided social services that imperial government couldn't or wouldn't supply. Trying to eliminate Christianity would have been like trying to eliminate trade or taxation. Technically possible, but practically devastating. Meanwhile, the persecution was creating exactly the kind of martyrs, an underground resistance that made Christianity more appealing rather than less. Christians who died rather than abandon their faith became symbols of moral courage that attracted sympathy even from non-Christians. Sound familiar? Authoritarian governments always struggle with the fact that persecuting people often makes them more popular, not less. Enter Constantine, who looked at this situation and made the most important religious decision in Western history. Instead of fighting Christianity, he'd join it. The traditional story is that Constantine saw a vision of the cross before the Battle of Milvian Bridge, 312 CE, and converted to Christianity after his victory. The political reality is probably that Constantine recognized Christianity as a political reality as probably this collegiate powerful force that could support imperial authority rather than threaten it. Constantine's conversion wasn't just personal. It was imperial policy. The Edict of Milan, 313 CE, legalized Christianity throughout the empire, returned confiscated church property, and essentially made Christianity a partner in imperial administration rather than its opponent. It was like a hostile corporate takeover that ended with a merger instead of a destruction. To be fair, Constantine's Christianity was pragmatic. He delayed baptism until his deathbed, a common practice at the time. Continued to use traditional Roman religious symbolism on coins and monuments, and generally behaved like someone who was Christian for political purposes as much as spiritual ones. Still, the sincerity of his conversion matters less than its consequences for both Christianity and the empire. The Council of Nicaea, 325 CE, demonstrates how Constantine understood the relationship between religious authority and imperial power. When Christian bishops couldn't agree on fundamental theological questions, specifically whether Jesus was fully divine or created by God the Father, Constantine convened an empire-wide council to settle the issue through debate and voting. It was like resolving a corporate policy dispute through a shareholders' meeting, except the corporation was the Roman Empire, and the policy was the nature of divine reality. And yet, the Nicene Creed that emerged from this council became the foundation of Orthodox Christian belief for the next 1,700 years. Constantine had essentially created Christian orthodoxy through imperial administration, demonstrating that political power could shape religious doctrine as much as religious conviction could influence political behavior. Meanwhile, Constantine was implementing other changes that would fundamentally alter the character of the empire. He founded Constantinople, 330 CE, as a new Rome that would be Christian from its inception rather than converted from paganism. The new capital was strategically located to control trade between Europe and Asia, positioned to defend the empire's most vulnerable frontiers, and designed to demonstrate that Christian emperors could build cities as magnificent as anything their pagan predecessors had achieved. Constantinople's creation marked the beginning of the empire's shift eastward, away from Italy and toward the wealthier, more populous provinces of the eastern Mediterranean. It was like a multinational corporation moving its headquarters from a traditional location to a more dynamic market, strategically sensible but symbolically significant. Still, Constantine's most important innovation was cultural rather than administrative. By embracing Christianity, he'd found a way to unify the diverse populations of the empire around shared religious identity rather than ethnic or geographic loyalty. Christianity provided a common language, shared values, and institutional structure that could transcend the local differences that had always threatened imperial cohesion. Let's be honest about what this meant. Constantine had solved the problem of imperial identity that had plagued Rome since Augustus. Instead of being Roman citizens who happened to live in different provinces, imperial subjects could now be Christians who happened to speak different languages and follow different local customs. It was like creating brand loyalty that transcended product lines. The irony, of course, is that Constantine's solution to the empire's problems contained the seeds of its eventual division. Christianity was stronger in the eastern provinces than in the west. Greek-speaking Christians had different theological traditions than Latin-speaking ones, and the Bishop of Rome was developing claims to authority that conflicted with imperial power. Sound familiar? Success often creates new problems that are more complex than the original ones. Constantine's death in 337 CE left an empire that was stable, prosperous, and unified around Christian identity, but also facing new challenges that traditional Roman solutions couldn't address. His sons would fight civil wars over imperial succession. Germanic tribes would continue pressuring the frontiers, and Christian theological disputes would create political divisions as serious as any ethnic or regional conflicts. And yet, Constantine had accomplished something remarkable. He transformed a dying pagan empire into a thriving Christian one without civil war, economic collapse, or military defeat. He'd proven that political systems could reinvent themselves completely while maintaining institutional continuity. To be fair, it helped that he was working with religious movement that was already popular, an organizational structure that was already functional. If you thought Constantine's success would ensure smooth transitions to the next generation, well, let's just say the Christian emperors proved to be just as capable of dynastic violence and political incompetence as their pagan predecessors. The empire was Christian now, but it was still Roman, and Romans had never quite figured out how to transfer power peacefully. Meanwhile, by 337 CE, the Roman Empire was like a classic car that had been restored with modern parts, still recognizably the same vehicle, but operating according to completely different principles than its original design. Constantine's Christian Empire was stable, wealthy, and administratively sophisticated, but it was also facing pressures that no amount of religious unity or bureaucratic efficiency could solve permanently. The first problem was succession, because apparently 500 years of imperial history hadn't taught Romans anything about transferring power peacefully. Constantine's sons, Constantius II Constans and Constantine II, immediately began fighting each other for control of different parts of the empire, proving that Christian emperors were just as capable of fratricidal violence as their pagan predecessors. Sound familiar? It's like watching a family business tear itself apart during the inheritance process. Except the business was the entire Mediterranean world. By 350 CE, Constantius II had eliminated his brothers and reunified the empire. But the civil wars had weakened frontier defenses and encouraged barbarian tribes to test Roman resolve. Meanwhile, internal Christian disputes were creating religious conflicts that made traditional Roman political disagreements look like polite differences of opinion. The Arian controversy, whether Jesus was equal to God the Father or subordinate to him, was dividing Christian communities and requiring imperial intervention to maintain religious unity. Let's be honest about what this meant. The empire that had once accommodated dozens of different local religions was now tearing itself apart over subtle theological distinctions that most people couldn't understand. It was like a corporation where employees spent more time arguing about mission statements than actually doing their jobs. Julian the Apostate 361-363 CE tried to reverse Constantine's religious revolution and restore traditional Roman paganism, proving that even intelligent, well-intentioned emperors could completely misread historical trends. Julian was everything a Roman emperor was supposed to be: militarily competent, intellectually sophisticated, administratively efficient. But his attempt to de-Christianize the empire was like trying to uninvent the printing press. Some changes are irreversible, and Constantine's religious transformation was one of them. Julian's death during a Persian campaign ended the last serious attempt to restore pagan Rome, but it also revealed how dependent the empire had become on individual imperial competence. Without strong personal leadership, the complex administrative system that Diocletian and Constantine had created couldn't function effectively. It was like a high-performance machine that required constant fine-tuning by expert mechanics. And yet, the empire's real problem wasn't religious or political. It was demographic and economic. The Germanic tribes pressuring Roman frontiers weren't just raiders anymore. They were entire peoples seeking new territories due to population growth, climate change, and pressure from other migrating groups further east. Meanwhile, the Roman population was declining due to plague, warfare, and economic factors that made large families unaffordable for many citizens. Theodosius I, 379 to 395 CE, was the last emperor to rule both eastern and western halves of the empire, and his reign demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of late imperial government. He defeated usurpers, settled barbarian tribes within imperial territory, and made Christianity the official state religion while banning pagan practices. To be fair, he was trying to create religious unity through legal enforcement, which was probably the only option available given the empire's increasing diversity. Still, Theodosius' decision to divide the empire between his sons Arcadius, east, and Honorius, west, after his death in 395 CE, marked the beginning of the end for unified Roman rule. The division was supposed to be administrative rather than permanent, but it became permanent because the two halves of the empire faced different challenges that required different solutions. The Eastern Empire, later called Byzantine, was wealthier, more urbanized, and more defensible than the West. Constantinople controlled trade routes between Europe and Asia. Greek cities had maintained their commercial networks, and the eastern frontiers were more stable than the Rhine-Danube line. Meanwhile, the Western Empire was dealing with barbarian invasions, economic decline, and political instability that made effective governance increasingly difficult. Meanwhile, the barbarian tribes were becoming more sophisticated in their relationships with Roman authority. Instead of simply raiding and retreating, groups like the Visigoths, Vandals, and Ostrogoths were negotiating treaties that gave them land and legal status within the empire in exchange for military service. It was like outsourcing imperial defense to contractors who gradually became more important than the regular employees. The sack of Rome by Alaric and the Visigoths in 410 CE shocked the ancient world, but was actually less significant than it seemed. Rome hadn't been the imperial capital for over a century. Most of its population had already fled, and the Visigoths were technically Roman allies who were owed bad pay rather than foreign enemies seeking to destroy the empire. Still, the psychological impact was enormous. If Rome itself wasn't safe, what did Roman power actually mean? If you thought the sack of Rome would inspire effective imperial response, think again. The Western imperial court, now based in Ravenna, was more concerned with court intrigue than frontier defense. Real power was increasingly exercised by barbarian generals like Stilicho and Aetius, who understood military affairs better than the Roman aristocrats who nominally commanded them. The Vandal conquest of Roman Africa, 429–439 CE, demonstrated how quickly imperial territories could be lost when local defenses collapsed. Genseric led 80,000 Vandals across the Strait of Gibraltar and conquered the empire's wealthiest western provinces in less than a decade. It was like watching a major corporate division get bought out by a smaller, more aggressive competitor, while headquarters argued about executive compensation. And yet, the most ominous development was cultural rather than military. Roman citizens in the western provinces were beginning to see barbarian rule as preferable to imperial government. Barbarian kings offered lower taxes, more predictable justice, and less bureaucratic interference than Roman administrators. Sound familiar? When your own customers prefer the competition, you're probably not managing your business very well. Attila the Hun, 440–450 CE, represented a different kind of threat entirely, unlike the Germanic tribes that were seeking to join the empire. The Huns were nomadic raiders who wanted to extract tribute rather than settle territories. Attila's invasions forced both Eastern and Western empires to pay enormous bribes to avoid destruction, demonstrating that Roman military power was no longer sufficient to defend Roman territories. The Battle of Chalons, 451 CE, was Rome's last great military victory, where Aetius led a coalition of Romans and barbarian allies against Attila's forces. The fact that Romang victory required barbarian assistance illustrated how completely the empire's military character had changed. Roman legions were now mostly Germanic mercenaries fighting under Roman banners for Roman pay, but with primary loyalty to their immediate commanders rather than abstract imperial authority. Leo, a successful defense of Rome against Attila in 452 CE, revealed another significant change. Papal authority was becoming more important than imperial power in protecting Roman citizens. When military force failed, religious authority succeeded, suggesting that Christianity was providing the unity and leadership that political institutions could no longer supply. Meanwhile, the Eastern Empire was demonstrating that Roman government could still function effectively under the right circumstances. Theodosius II, 408 to 450 CE, successfully defended Constantinople, codified Roman law, and maintained prosperous trade relationships throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. The problem wasn't that Roman institutions had become obsolete. It was that the Western Empire lacked the resources and leadership to make them work. The final act began with Vandal's sack of Rome in 455 CE, which was more thorough than Alaric's earlier raid, but equally ineffective at restoring barbarian power. By this point, Italy was being fought over by Ostrogoths, Vandals, and various Roman claimants, while imperial authority had effectively collapsed outside of a few fortified cities. Odoacer's deposition of Romulus Augustulus in 476 CE is traditionally considered the end of the Western Roman Empire, but it was really just the formalization of a process that had been ongoing for decades. Odoacer was a Germanic military commander who controlled Italy and decided he didn't need to maintain the fiction of Roman imperial authority anymore. He sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople and ruled Italy as a king rather than as a Roman general. To be fair, most people probably didn't notice the difference. Odoacer maintained Roman law, Roman administration, and Roman cultural institutions while providing more effective defense than recent emperors had managed. It was like a corporate restructuring where the management changed, but the company continued, operating under the same policies. And yet, 476 CE marked the end of over 1,000 years of Roman political dominance in the Western Mediterranean. The city that had grown from a collection of hills by the Tiber into the greatest empire in human history was now just another regional capital under barbarian rule. Still, Roman law, Roman engineering, Roman Christianity, and Roman cultural traditions would continue to influence European development for centuries after Roman political power had disappeared. The Eastern Empire continued for another 1,000 years as the Byzantine Empire, maintaining Roman legal and administrative traditions while evolving into something that would have been unrecognizable to Augustus or Trajan. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church preserved Roman organizational methods and Latin language, creating a different kind of Roman Empire based on religious rather than political authority. Sound familiar? Successful civilizations don't really die. They transform into something else, leaving behind institutions, ideas, and cultural practices that shape their successors in ways that aren't always obvious. The Western Roman Empire ended, but Roman civilization continued in new forms that were adapted to medieval rather than ancient conditions. Let's be honest. After following Rome from Volfray's twins to barbarian kings, from republican idealism to imperial pragmatism, from Mediterranean city-state to transcontinental empire, the most remarkable thing isn't that it eventually collapsed. The remarkable thing is that it lasted over 1,000 years while maintaining recognizable institutions, legal principles, and cultural values that still influence us today. That sound familiar? Every modern nation faces some version of the challenges that ultimately overwhelmed Rome. How to balance expansion with stability. How to maintain civic virtue while managing imperial complexity. How to adapt traditional institutions to changing circumstances without losing essential character. The United States struggles with imperial overstretch and political polarization. The European Union wrestles with unity versus sovereignty. And every democracy faces the tension between popular will and expert judgment that paralyzed the Roman Republic. To be fair, Rome's longevity was unprecedented and probably won't be matched again. Modern communications, transportation, and weapons technology make both conquest and rebellion happen faster than Romans could have imagined. Still, the fundamental problems of governance, how to create institutions that are both effective and legitimate, how to balance competing interests without destroying social cohesion, how to manage success without being corrupted by it, remain essentially unchanged. And yet, Rome's most important lesson might be about adaptation rather than collapse. The Roman Empire didn't die in 476 CE. It transformed into the Byzantine Empire, the Catholic Church, the Holy Roman Empire, and dozens of successor states. That preserved Roman law, Roman administration, and Roman cultural traditions in new forms. Medieval Europe was built on Roman foundations. Renaissance humanism rediscovered Roman literature and philosophy, and modern legal systems still use principles developed by Roman jurists. Meanwhile, the specific mechanisms of Roman decline offer surprisingly relevant warnings for contemporary societies. The empire became too expensive to maintain through traditional revenue sources, leading to currency debasement and inflation that destroyed economic confidence. Military expenses consumed increasing percentages of government budgets while providing diminishing security returns. Urban populations became dependent on government subsidies that created political pressure for unsustainable spending. Immigration and cultural change created identity conflicts that political systems couldn't resolve peacefully. Still, Rome's greatest failure was probably political rather than economic or military. The republican system that had made expansion possible couldn't adapt to imperial responsibilities without destroying the civic virtue and constitutional limits that had made it successful in the first place. Imperial institutions that worked brilliantly under competent emperors became dangerous under incompetent ones, and the empire never solved the fundamental problem of peaceful succession that had destroyed the republic. Of course, expecting any political system to last forever is probably unrealistic. Rome governed more territory, incorporated more diverse populations, and maintained institutional continuity longer than any comparable state in human history. The fact that it eventually succumbed to pressures that no ancient government could have managed indefinitely doesn't diminish its extraordinary achievements in law, engineering, administration, and cultural synthesis. Let's be clear about what Rome accomplished that still matters. Today, it created the first truly multicultural state where citizenship was based on legal status rather than ethnic identity, developed legal principles that protect individual rights while maintaining social order, and demonstrated that diverse populations could coexist peacefully under institutions that respected local differences while promoting common values. Modern democracies are still trying to solve these same problems with mixed results. Meanwhile, Roman engineering and urban planning solved practical problems that many modern cities haven't mastered. Roman roads, aqueducts, and sewers were built to last centuries and often did. Roman concrete was superior to modern concrete in many applications. Roman urban design created livable cities that provided clean water, waste disposal, public spaces, and commercial districts that functioned efficiently despite populations that wouldn't be matched again until the industrial era. And yet, Rome's most enduring legacy might be cultural rather than institutional. Latin became the language of education, law, and religion throughout medieval Europe, preserving Roman literature and philosophy for later generations to rediscover. Roman legal concepts like due process, burden of proof, and individual rights became foundations of Western jurisprudence. Roman architectural styles influenced building design for over 1,500 years and continue to shape government buildings. Universities and monuments today dot the Catholic Church. In particular, preserve Roman organizational methods while adapting them to religious purposes. Papal administration used Roman bureaucratic techniques. Canon law developed from Roman legal principles, and church hierarchy reflected Roman governmental structure. Christianity spread throughout Europe using Roman roads, Roman cities, and Roman administrative networks. creating a different kind of universal empire based on shared faith rather than political authority. Still, perhaps Rome's most relevant lesson is about the relationship between success and failure in human institutions. Rome succeeded because it was adaptable, practical, and willing to learn from others while maintaining core values and institutional continuity. It failed when it became too rigid to adapt, too complex to manage efficiently, and too dependent on individual competence rather than systemic resilience. Sound familiar? Every successful organization, whether corporate, political, or cultural, eventually faces the choice between continued adaptation and gradual irrelevance. Rome chose adaptation repeatedly, from monarchy to republic to empire, from city-state to Mediterranean power to global civilization, from pagan to Christian, from Italian to multicultural. Each transformation preserved essential elements while discarding outdated features, allowing Roman civilization to survive in new forms even after Roman political power disappeared. To be fair, this adaptability also made Rome vulnerable to the kind of gradual transformation that eventually made it something entirely different. The empire that Constantine ruled was Roman in name and institutional continuity, but it would have been unrecognizable to Augustus or Cicero. Whether this represents successful evolution or fundamental corruption depends on your perspective and priorities. The lesson for modern societies might be that institutional survival requires constant reinvention, but reinvention risks losing the essential characteristics that made institutions valuable in the first place. Rome navigated this paradox successfully for over a millennium, which suggests that the balance is achievable but requires exceptional leadership, favorable circumstances, and perhaps some historical luck. And yet, the most human lesson from Roman history might be about the consistency of human nature across time and circumstances. Roman politicians were as ambitious, corrupt, and power-hungry as modern ones, but also as capable of genuine service, moral courage, and visionary leadership. Roman citizens were as susceptible to demagoguery and propaganda as contemporary voters, but also as capable of civic virtue and collective wisdom when institutions functioned properly. Meanwhile, the specific problems that destroyed the Roman Republic, political polarization, economic inequality, the militarization of politics, the decline of civic norms, and the appeal of strongman leadership to people who've lost faith in traditional institutions, remain relevant to every democracy. The Roman experience suggests that these problems are manageable but not permanently solvable, requiring constant vigilance and periodic renewal to prevent systemic breakdown. If you thought studying Roman history would provide clear answers about how to avoid Rome's mistakes, think again. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, and the rhymes are often more complex than simple analogies suggest. Rome's rise and fall offer warnings and examples, but not blueprints or formulas that can be applied directly to different circumstances and challenges. Still, Rome's ultimate message might be both humbling and inspiring. Even the greatest human achievements are temporary, but the ideas, institutions, and cultural contributions of successful civilizations can influence human development. For millennia after their political power has ended, the Roman Empire fell, but Roman law still shapes legal systems worldwide. Roman engineering principles still influence construction projects, and Roman literary and philosophical traditions still inform education and cultural development. That's right. We're still living in Rome's shadow, speaking languages influenced by Latin, governed by institutions derived from Roman models, and grappling with political and social challenges the Romans faced and sometimes solved. The Wolf boys who founded a city by the Tiber couldn't have imagined that their descendants would create a civilization whose influence would extend across continents and centuries. Of course, they probably would have understood the essential human drives that made it all possible: the desire for security and prosperity, the appeal of power and glory, the satisfaction of building something larger than individual ambition, and the eternal human hope that this time we'll do better than our predecessors. Sound familiar? Plus God change, plus est la même chose. The more things change, the more they stay the same. And yet, perhaps that's Rome's final gift to us. The knowledge that human beings are capable of extraordinary achievements when they combine individual ambition with collective purpose, practical wisdom with visionary leadership, and respect for tradition with willingness to adapt. The Roman story is ultimately our story, a 1,000-year experiment in human cooperation, competition, and creativity that succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations and failed in ways that still teach us about our own limitations and possibilities. Let's be honest, that's not a bad legacy for a civilization that started with 2 babies, a wolf, and an argument over which hill would make the best place to build a city. From such humble beginnings, Roma Eterna, the Eternal City, became humanity's longest-running political experiment, greatest cultural achievement, and most enduring reminder that with enough ambition, intelligence, and sheer bloody-minded determination, people can build institutions that outlast empires and influence civilizations they never imagined. Meanwhile, the pizza's still excellent. Let's be honest, declaring the Roman Empire dead in 476 CE is like declaring a rock band finished after their lead singer quits, only to watch them reunite every few decades under different names with new lineups. Sound familiar? Rome has been falling and reviving for over 1,500 years, and frankly, it's gotten pretty good at both. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, Byzantine emperors were reading about the fall of Rome while sitting on thrones they considered perfectly Roman, ruling territories they called the Roman Empire, and generally wondering what all the fuss was about. The Eastern Roman Empire continued for another 1,000 years after 476 CE, maintaining Roman law, Roman administration, and Roman pretensions while evolving into something that combined Greek culture, Christian theology, and imperial bureaucracy. To be fair, the Byzantines had a point. They held unbroken institutional continuity from Augustus, maintained Roman legal traditions, and controlled the original capital that Constantine had established. If you thought political legitimacy was about constitutional succession rather than ethnic identity, then medieval Constantinople had a better claim to being Roman than medieval Rome itself. And yet, the real heirs of Roman civilization weren't emperors or kings. They were monks, lawyers, and scholars who preserved Roman literature, philosophy, and legal principles through the chaos of early medieval Europe. Monasteries became libraries that saved classical texts from destruction. Cathedral schools taught Latin grammar and rhetoric, and university law faculties rediscovered Roman jurisprudence and adapted it to contemporary needs. The Holy Roman Empire, founded by Charlemagne in 800 CE, represented the most ambitious attempt to restore Roman political authority in Western Europe. Of course, as Voltaire famously observed, it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. But it lasted over 1,000 years by combining Germanic military organization, Christian religious authority, and Roman administrative traditions. It was like a cover band that became more successful than the original artist. Still, the most successful Roman revival was probably the Catholic Church, which essentially became a spiritual empire using Roman organizational methods. Papal administration used Roman bureaucratic techniques. Canon law developed from Roman legal principles, and church hierarchy reflected Roman governmental structure. The Pope called himself Pontifex Maximus, a title originally held by Roman emperors. Church officials wore togas modified into vestments, and Latin remained the language of religious scholarship for over a millennium. Meanwhile, every subsequent European empire claimed Roman inheritance and tried to position itself as Rome's legitimate successor. The Ottoman Empire controlled former Roman territories and called its rulers Caesar. Caesar became Kaiser in German and Tsar in Russian. Napoleon crowned himself emperor and commissioned neoclassical monuments that deliberately evoked Roman grandeur. Hitler's Third Reich explicitly claimed to be reviving Roman imperial traditions, though with considerably less competence and infinitely worse moral judgment. If you thought modern democracies would be immune to Roman nostalgia, think again. The United States was founded by men who read Roman historians, quoted Roman philosophers, and designed government buildings that look like Roman temples. The Senate, the Capitol, the Supreme Court, and dozens of state capitals are architectural homages to Roman political ideals. American founders saw themselves as creating a new Rome that would avoid the mistakes that had destroyed the Republic. To be fair, the parallels are sometimes uncomfortably precise. Both Rome and America began as republics that expanded through military conquest while claiming to spread civilization and liberty. Both developed global empires while maintaining democratic institutions at home. Both struggled with the tension between imperial responsibilities and republican values. Both faced challenges from immigration, economic inequality, and political polarization that tested their constitutional systems. And yet, the Roman influence on modern life extends far beyond politics into areas so fundamental that we barely notice them. Romance languages, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, are basically Latin dialects that evolved over time. English borrowed thousands of Latin words and still uses Latin phrases in legal, medical, and academic contexts. Roman numerals appear on everything from clock faces to movie credits to Super Bowl logos. Legal systems throughout the Western world use principles developed by Roman jurists. Innocent until proven guilty, the right to legal representation, the burden of proof on accusers, and the concept that laws should be written down and publicly available. Modern contract law, property rights, and corporate structures all trace back to Roman legal innovations that were preserved through medieval universities and rediscovered during the Renaissance. Meanwhile, Roman engineering principles still influence modern construction. Concrete technology, arch construction, and urban planning concepts developed by Roman engineers remain relevant to contemporary architects and city planners. The Roman road network became the foundation for medieval and modern European transportation systems. Roman aqueducts inspired modern water distribution systems. Of course, the most obvious Roman survival is Christianity, which transformed from a persecuted sect into the dominant religion of the Western world, using Roman organizational methods and administrative networks. Christian theology incorporated Greek philosophy. Christian institutional structure reflected Roman government, and Christian expansion followed Roman trade routes and political boundaries. Let's be clear about what this means. Rome didn't fall so much as it transformed into the cultural foundation of Western civilization. Medieval Europe was built on Roman legal, administrative, and cultural foundations. Renaissance humanism rediscovered Roman literature and philosophy. Enlightenment. Political theory drew heavily on Roman republican ideals. Modern democratic institutions reflect Roman innovations in representative government and constitutional law. Still, perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Rome's afterlife is how it continues to serve as a reference point for understanding political success and failure. Every rising power gets compared to Rome. Every declining empire gets analyzed for Roman symptoms. And every political crisis prompts discussions about whether we're witnessing our own version of Roman decline. Sound familiar? The fall of Rome has become a universal metaphor for imperial overstretch, political corruption, and civilizational decline. Politicians invoke Roman examples to support their arguments. Historians use Roman analogies to explain contemporary events. And popular culture treats Roman history as a source of eternal lessons about power, ambition, and human nature. And yet, the persistence of Roman influence suggests that successful civilizations don't really die. They become part of the cultural DNA of their successors. Roman ideas, institutions, and achievements were too useful and too attractive to disappear, just because Roman political power had ended. Instead, they were adapted, modified, and integrated into new civilizations that built on Roman foundations while developing their own distinctive characteristics. To be fair, this kind of cultural persistence isn't unique to Rome. Chinese civilization has survived multiple dynastic collapses. Greek intellectual traditions influenced Islamic and Western thought long after Greek political independence ended, and Egyptian architectural and religious concepts influenced Mediterranean cultures. For millennia, successful civilizations create cultural legacies that outlast their political institutions. Meanwhile, the lesson for contemporary societies might be that building lasting institutions and cultural achievements is more important than maintaining political power indefinitely. Rome's military dominance lasted about 500 years, but Roman legal, architectural, and administrative innovations have influenced human development for over 2,000 years and continue to shape modern life in ways that most people don't even recognize. If you thought this epilogue would end with some profound conclusion about Rome's eternal significance, well, let's just say that Rome's real achievement was proving that human beings can create institutions, ideas, and cultural traditions that transcend the particular circumstances of their origin and continue to influence human development across centuries and continents. That's right. We're all Romans now, whether we realize it or not. Every time you use a legal system, live in a planned city, drive on a paved road, or participate in representative government, you're benefiting from innovations that originated in a collection of hills by the Tiber River over 2,000 years ago. The Wolf Boys did good.